Welcome to Trinity Radio, and just look at yourself. You found the Christian channel that loves atheists. And today we're doing something a little different. We're going into some theology and some stuff that has to do with the doctrine of salvation, the problem of evil, and really just a lot of metaphysical ideas that are super interesting and fun to talk about. I invite you, even if you're not a believer and might not think this is very relevant to you, to listen in and see what it's like for Christians to think deeply about some of the issues that we find to be some of the most difficult issues when we study Christian theology. We're going to be looking at a debate between Kirk, MacGregor, the Molinist, and Guillaume, Bignon, who is the Calvinist. These are philosophers and theologians, and Guillaume, the Calvinist, wrote a book that is becoming more well-known all the time, and it is a defense of a philosophical idea that is often involved in Calvinism called compatibilism. And this is compatibilism, just kind of giving you a fresher if you're not used to these discussions. Compatibilism is the notion that determinism, the idea that you don't have the sort of libertarian freedom that free will that some people think they have, but determinism rather, the idea that everything that you do has been determined or predetermined either by nature or by God on theistic determinism. And they think that idea, determinism, is compatible with a meaningful sense of talking about freedom and moral responsibility. You can be morally responsible, even if it's the case that that your choices, beliefs, decisions were all determined by God before time began. So we're going to look at that debate as the Molinist, the non-Calvinist, who takes the position that God is aware of all the ways that he could make, or all the ways that things could go with libertarian creatures, free creatures who really have free will, of the sort that they could have done otherwise, or nothing external to them determined what they were going to do. That this guy's going to present an idea that that position, that God looks at all of these possible ways the world could have been and selects among those the one that he knows best fits whatever purposes he has. And that means that he's going to have to select a world that there may be no world where man has free will, and yet there's no evil or pain or suffering. And so perhaps that explains why the world has the level of suffering and pain that it has in it. But to cover this debate today, as they just talk about how they address the problem of evil, why would a loving God allow pain and suffering like we have? As they talk about how Calvinists and Molinists will answer that question, I brought in a Molinist all my own. I'm a Molinist myself, but I brought someone in who's a full-time Molinist, and I'm going to bring him on the screen right now if I can figure out how to do it. Welcome, Dr. Tim Stratton, and professor at Trinity College of the Bible and Theological Seminary.
Hey, Braxton. Thanks for having me on the show again. And I'm honored to be a professor at Trinity and also to be a full-time Molinist.
And we're honored to have you, Tim.
Full-time Molinist. No. I was just going to say that this debate, you mentioned that there's non-believers and atheists watching. And I think this is a debate, an in-house debate among Christians that atheists should really care about, because I think my understanding of Christianity can answer their questions and solve their problems. I don't think the Calvinist view can do that, especially the exhaustive divine determinism view. But this is what Kirk, MacGregor and Guillaume, Bignon were discussing in this debate. And so you and I just thought, hey, this would be a great debate to discuss.
I got to tell you, Tim, I loved this debate. I really did. I enjoyed it. Obviously, in any debate on issues that you like to talk about, there are moments where you kind of are screaming at your phone saying, why doesn't somebody say this? But honestly, in this one, there wasn't much of that, because I thought, I know there's some things we're going to point out here that we think are important, but Kirk, MacGregor and Guillaume were just well suited for this. I think they got
Yeah.
along well. They weren't afraid to say harsh things, but there was obviously a jovial tone to it. It's one of the
Right.
reasons why I really admire both of these guys, not
Hmm.
only for their academic prowess, but also for their ability to interact on issues that can be emotionally charged and just look at the issues and be friends about it. I thought that was pretty cool, and
Yeah.
I greatly admire them both.
Man, I totally agree with you. I'd like to take a moment just to sing the praises of both of these guys. Let me start out with a guy that I disagree with. Uh, in my opinion, Guillaume Bignon is a top shelf philosopher. And I just got to say that I'll never be that much, in my opinion. In fact, I got to tell you, Braxton, I mean, you might want to let me go after I say this, but I don't even consider myself to be, an official academic. I kind of got into this whole academic thing through the back door. It was never really my intention. Uh, it wasn't my intent to find myself swimming in these waters, to mix metaphors, with these highly trained professional philosophers. I
Yeah,
was
that may be
simply a
that.
guy.
Go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, no, you go ahead.
I was just going to say that I understand that level of humility, and you certainly do approach things with an everyman sort of way when it comes to explaining things to people. You explain things in a way that I think people who have no exposure to academics can pick things up, and that's one of the things that one of the reasons God's used you. But I mean, you may not feel like an academic, but it's a fact of reality that by any particular measure, you're an academic.
Well, I don't feel like one. I was simply a guy that really struggled to get through high school. I was on the basketball team, and the coach was always warning me that I wasn't going to be able to suit up for the next game because my grades weren't good enough. I did
Well, I
really
was that
bad
way
on
too,
the
Tim. But like,
ACT.
did they
What?
teach Molinism at your school? Was that one of the things you all discussed and talked about? Because it probably wasn't. And I know you're probably like me that
No,
when they finally gave you stuff to study that you enjoy, it was straight A's.
right. Well, yeah, and I got to tell you, I mean, really struggling through high school, even struggled through my undergrad. By the way, at University of Nebraska at Kearney, got to wear my shirt. That's where I did my undergrad. I still do ministry there today,
What are they?
but
The
really
yellow?
struggled there
What's on your shirt?
until
Is a goat?
it's
The,
a loper, an antelope.
the yellow lopers? Is that what they're called? Go yellow lopers.
Yeah, we're blue and gold, so there you go.
The libertarian
But
lopers.
no, they are libertarian lopers, in the land of the free. Um, but come on, man, you're throwing me way off. I'm trying to say some nice
Yeah.
things about Guillaume.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Talk about Guillaume. Guillaume's
yeah, no, I
libertarian
just
too,
wanted to.
whether he's aware of it or not.
Well, I agree with that. I do agree with that much. Um, Now, I was just going to say, I was a Christian at a very young age, but when I dedicated my life to Christ, when I said I was going to be a Jesus freak, that's when everything changed, and I started getting really good grades after that. I was around 20 years old at the time at UNK. Um, but anyway, I still don't feel like an academic. I kind of got into this whole thing through the back door. So, needless to say, I know I've not arrived, and I'm still learning the rules of academia, it seems to me. And sometimes I make some mistakes along the way, but I'm having a lot of fun in the process. And I try to bring others along with me when I learn more about God. But with that said, uh, I have studied these topics probably more than most theologians and philosophers. And I've literally spent hours and hours every day over the past decade studying these topics. Now, let me talk about Guillaume Bignon. He's probably spent the same amount of time studying these topics, if not more.
Hmm.
And he probably got into philosophical theology through the front door as opposed to me going through the back door. And this is why I take Bignon seriously. I do believe he's offered the best defense of Calvinistic compatibilism in the world today, in his book, Excusing Sinners and Blaming God. So I encourage people to read his book, and especially his new one called Confessions of a French Atheist. Now, so yeah, all that to say, I highly respect Guillaume Bignon, and I want him to know that. I don't know if he knows that I feel that way about him, but I really do. And I'm just trying to have a cordial and academic discussion with him, and have some pushback, And that's all. Now, let me talk about Kirk MacGregor. I don't agree with everything that Kirk says, but he and I are both Molinists. There was a couple things he said in the debate where I disagreed with him. But by and large, I agreed with the vast majority of what he said, and I thought he made some great points. I think Bignon made some great points too. But Kirk MacGregor is a philosopher who I've learned so much from over the past decade, and he's literally written the book on Luis de Molina and knows so much about libertarian freedom and divine middle knowledge. So I encourage you to get his book, his biography on Luis de Molina. And he's kind of taken me under his wing, and even he wrote the foreword to my book. Here it is. And Kirk's name is on the cover. So thank you,
Awesome.
Kirk. But I just got to say, I'm currently working on the second edition of that book. It's going to be way bigger and much bigger and stronger. Really looking forward to that. I've completely gutted chapter 12 and replaced it. And I think Guillaume will be very interested in that because I talked about him in chapter 12, and it's going to be a little bit different take this time. So anyway, stay tuned for that. But here's the bottom line.
Well, wait, you're going to say something about the two of them. I was going to say, if you don't think that this debate was a party, let me just show you what happened. Look at these men. They could not be more happy. These are not enemies. These are brothers, right. And it looks like something that some frat boys would enjoy being part of, from the way it looks right there. So great guys.
I absolutely loved the tone of this debate. Yeah. It was completely different than the tone that was in, that I found myself in debating Dr. James White.
It was a different tone, wasn't it?
It was a different tone. I didn't really have fun. I guess, to me, it was it felt like more of a fight. I love Dr. White. I know he loves me, but I didn't like the tone. Part of that was probably my fault. I was just really nervous, that being my first debate on that stage. All that to say,
maybe it was, Tim, but do you like, I feel like you're being humble there. I mean, you are being humble. I feel like, I don't know if James White's going to say, maybe it was my fault that it felt a little aggressive. But in any case, you're being a gentleman, and I would want nothing less from our professors. You're fantastic, and you performed well. And who cares if you talked about superheroes? We talk about superheroes here all the time. So
we're going to talk about them tonight. So
let's do it, man. Well, let's move forward, man. I'm excited about this.
Yeah, I'll just say that both Kirk MacGregor and Guillaume Bignon, I consider them both to be philosophical juggernauts. And when they speak, their words ought to be carefully considered. And so that's what we're going to do today.
Right on. All right. So we're going to jump into the video and take a look at what Guillaume had to say.
Problem of evil. Now, there's a number of different things that are called the problem of evil. So we'll see if we tackle several different versions of that. Maybe a good starting point would be the classical problem of evil as an argument from the atheist against the existence of God, which goes like this: if God is all powerful, he can prevent all evil. And if God is all good, he wants to prevent all evil. And so if he can and he wants, then he does, but in fact he doesn't. And so he's not there, right? That's the gist of the argument from the atheist against God's existence.
Yeah. All right, Tim, what are your thoughts?
Well, I've interacted with a version of this argument, which was offered to me by an atheist years ago. And so the argument that was given to me is one that I've really been wrestling with for, I don't know, probably 8 years now. And I think it's a little bit stronger than the one that Guillaume just offered, because it really focuses on the what I refer to as the big three of God's omni-attributes. So it would go like this. Premise one, God, by definition, is omnibenevolent, omnipotent, and omniscient. 2, if God is omnibenevolent, which means all good and perfectly loving, then he desires to prevent all evil. 3, if God is omnipotent, he has the power to prevent all evil. 4, if God is omniscient, he knows how to prevent all evil. 5, the world is suffused with evil. 6, therefore God is either not omnibenevolent, not omnipotent, or not omniscient, or perhaps none of the above. Well, 7, therefore God, by definition, does not exist. So the problem with this argument is that if God is omnibenevolent, or a God of love, then God desires to create a world where the best kind of love is possible. However, I've argued at length in my book and on my website and on my YouTube channel that, and in a journal article, that I've argued at length that this requires libertarian freedom. The best kind of love requires libertarian freedom. And thus, the same power that allows humans to experience the best kind of love is the same power that allows humans to do and commit moral evil. Now, Bignon has often said that libertarian freedom, or the free will defense, is only applicable to the problem of moral evil. But I have applied it to all kinds of afflictions. I think we can solve all the problems of evil. And I'd be remiss if I took the credit, since the Apostle Paul, I think, implies this much in 1 Corinthians 4:17. I really did get this whole concept came into my head after reading the words of Paul. When Paul says these light momentary afflictions prepare us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. And Paul wasn't just talking about moral evil here. Paul provides a whole long list of all of these afflictions, all this pain, evil, and suffering that he was experiencing. But then he says that these are light momentary afflictions, and then says that they prepare us for eternity. And so I've really worked with that and gone into more depth and detail. So I encourage people to read it in my book or my other work to see what I mean by that. But I do have an argument that is in the last chapter of my book. And it's a deductive argument summarizing all of this, and really kind of inspired by 2 Corinthians 4:17. And I call it Molinism versus all the problems of evil. And so, that goes a little bit something like this. Premise 1, if God is omnibenevolent, then he desires genuine eternal love relations with humans. 2, if God desires genuine eternal love relations with humans, then he creates humans with libertarian freedom. Because, 2.1, a genuine eternal love relationship between God and humans necessarily requires that humans possess libertarian freedom. Premise 3, if God creates humans with libertarian freedom, then he allows humans to experience suffering. Because, 3.1, suffering can result from libertarian-free humans. And 3.2, God created a world in which he knew that unless he permitted all kinds of evil, some would not freely choose to eternally preserve the suffering-free state of affairs in the new heavens and the new earth. And I put 2 Corinthians 4:17. 4, God is omnibenevolent. 5, therefore God, since he is omnibenevolent, allows humans to experience suffering. So you'll see that this argument makes use of all three of the essential ingredients of the soteriological view of Molinism that I discuss in my book. So this is more than just mere Molinism. This is a soteriological view of Molinism, and this argument makes use of 1, human libertarian freedom, 2, God's middle knowledge, and 3, the omnibenevolence of God. So it's important to see that no rival view of God's sovereignty has logical access to this specific argument. And with God's eternal intent in mind, it's easy to see that God is not a morally guilty mind. And this came up in their debate. That is to say, the concept of mens rea does not apply to God if Molinism is true. So what do you think about all that, Braxton?
No, naturally, I agree with this argument. I feel compelled to voice the one objection that commonly comes to, and this would affect, I think, if not just one, maybe more than one of your premises. And that is the notion that, okay, Dr. Stratton, you're here telling us that we should drop Calvinism, drop determinism, because the highest form of love requires libertarian freedom. And yet we had the mutual love within the Trinity in a timeless state, sans creation.
Yeah.
So how do you work with all of that? First of all, it would seem like you'd have to argue, because I noticed in the premise here, Tim, and I'm just interested because I'm sure you've thought through all this. This is not me trying to get you. I'm actually genuinely interested about how you handle this, because I noticed you mentioned in 2.1, premise 2.1, a genuine eternal love relationship between God and humans necessarily requires that humans possess libertarian freedom. When I think about writing arguments, it seems like you intentionally specified humans instead of and I imagine you're trying to not deal with that question about the nature of God's freedom when we're trying to focus on this, and all we need for this is human freedom. But then it makes me wonder, okay, I know Tim affirms that God has libertarian freedom of a sort, at least in the source sense, that nothing external to him determines his choices. But in other words, it seems like maybe have to be some support to get me on board as a Calvinist with the notion that I would have to believe in freely given love when even if I adopted human libertarian free will as the argument requires, I might think of the counter example of God, because in the Trinity, I don't yet believe, you haven't yet given me an argument to think that God has libertarian freedom.
Yeah. So first of all, Kirk, MacGregor gave a fantastic argument for God's libertarian freedom during the debate, and Guillaume Bignon never rejected it. Didn't even try.
Oh, it was fantastic. I'm sorry. I know we kind of have a little bit of structure to this because we have what we want to cover, but oh my gosh, Tim, you're absolutely right. Because I listened to 2 or 3 debates this weekend, but I'm thinking it's the one where he basically argued from the bottom to the top. Basically, if at the lowest levels there's not free will, then there's not free will at the top levels. And he was doing a parody, I think, of something maybe in Guillaume's book from what he said. Does that sound right?
Yeah, I think something along those lines.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, Kirk gave a fantastic argument. Bignon in the past has made claims that he wasn't sure if God even had libertarian freedom, and didn't, and he said things to the effect that he didn't think it would be that much of, wouldn't be that big of a deal if he didn't. And I've argued otherwise. It would be a big deal if God didn't have libertarian freedom. In fact, I've offered those arguments in my book as well. But Kirk gave an argument with a different spin to it. But to answer your question about my argument, God is love, 1 John 4:8. So when we're talking about the ability to do otherwise, I don't think God has the ability not to love. That's just his nature. God is love, and he loves, each person of the Trinity loves the other persons of the Trinity. Each person of the Trinity loves every other person ever created. I would argue that God even loves Satan, right? But Satan hates God. So, but you can't force love upon a person. That's intuitively obvious. Now, what I do, and I've talked about this on my website, I think in an article called "The Best Kind of Love." I could be wrong on that, but
no, I've read the article. I do remember that now that you mentioned it on Freethinker. Yeah.
So here's the deal. Love can't be forced upon somebody else or on someone by somebody else. So, but God is love by nature. It's not forced upon him by something or someone else. Now, if God gave us a loving nature, it would be forced upon us by God. So he can't do that. So he's got to give us the ability to do otherwise, I believe. But God is free in the source sense. Nothing is determining him to love other people. He's just loving by nature. So, but God can't force us to freely love. That's impossible. That's like trying to make create a married bachelor. So God gives us libertarian freedom so we can resist his love or not. So I would just point people to that article to get started. And
I'm looking at the other premises right now. I'm not looking away and ignoring you. And yeah, I mean, I would want to look at it further, but it looks good to me. And with that clarification, I think we got a strong argument here.
Cool.
Yeah. So go ahead, continue. What's the next thing that comes to mind. Are we ready to go to the next clip? I think we might be.
Yeah, let's go to the next clip. Yeah.
Okay, let's do that now.
The argument from the atheist against God's existence. And in that light, Christians have known to respond with two different things. One is to say that God may not get all he wants, even though he's omnipotent, because indeterministic free will choices may turn out to fall on the wrong side, right? So it's the use of free will as an answer to the problem of evil, to say God cannot determine the outcome of human choices, otherwise they would not be free, because free will and determinism are not compatible. That's the incompatibilist position. And so that way God, even though he's omnipotent, cannot determine the outcome of our choices. So some of those fall on the wrong side. And so that's how we have evil, even though God really wishes that it didn't happen. It's just free will brings it about. And then the second response that's given by Christians traditionally is that even if God gets all he wants, he may not necessarily want there not to be any evil, even though he's perfectly good, because there may be greater goods that necessitate the existence of evil, right? So evil might be a necessary means to the end of securing some greater goods that couldn't be secured without evil. So,
okay, Tim, you have things to say about this. I keep having trouble here. Okay. Tim, you have some things to say about this, obviously, but let me see if I understand, just for the audience to know, and let me see if I understand for you to tell me what MacGregor's response later is to this point, basically. It seems like the response is something like, you are acting like you can use greater good arguments. But for the audience, greater good is when you say, in response to, why would a loving, all-knowing God, all-powerful God, allow some particular instance of suffering when he could prevent it, and a loving God would want to prevent it, right? And so a greater good argument is or theodicy or defense or whatever, is any response that tries to say the reason God did or permitted, actualized or permitted this evil was for some greater good that could only be achieved. In some way, it's like you imagine the evil being bound to the good. So the only way you get the good is if you allow the evil. And so Guillaume is here saying, that we can say that too. Calvinists can say that too. And MacGregor wants to say, I don't see how you can, because on your view, God could have determined that everyone do exactly the right thing all the time. Is that basically what you got from that?
Yeah. And, that's something I even brought that up in my debate with James White, that exact point. God could have had perfection from the beginning. He could have had 100% glory from, everybody could have glorified him. There could have been no evil. It seems you could have had heaven from the beginning.
Yeah, and Tim, on top of that, you have, I remember Jerry Walls way back, like 7 or 8 years ago, saying in his speech at Houston Baptist, he was talking why Calvinism's false or whatever he said, and he was saying that, he pointed out that what you and I probably talk about all the time now, but at the time it was news to me or I didn't think about it, that on compatibilism, of course, right, they talk about free will. And if you're new to this, you should know that Calvinists believe in free will. They just don't believe in free will like the way that non-Calvinists believe in it, what we call libertarian free will. They believe in a view called compatibilism that says, okay, well, determinism is true, but somehow we can, you can still have a meaningful sense of freedom, even if all your beliefs and actions are determined, and morality and all those kind of things. But Walls pointed out then, well, yeah, if you want to talk about free will on compatibilism, then what that means is, on your view, God could have determined it such that everyone freely, on your view of freedom, everyone freely does exactly what they should.
Right. And that's why I spend most of my time focusing on determinism. Does my interlocutor affirm determinism? And that's the view that antecedent conditions are sufficient to necessitate, an event is determined if antecedent conditions are sufficient to necessitate the event. So then if one wants to say that everything is determined, then you would say antecedent conditions are sufficient to necessitate all effects. And when I talk about exhaustive divine determinism, I'm primarily focused on God, either via his decree or the initial conditions of the universe that he created or whatever, that there are these antecedent conditions up to God that are sufficient to necessitate everything about the human, including
What you're
what you
saying,
think about.
am I truncating it too much? You're using the proper academic terms, even though you're not an academic, according to you. But to put it on the bottom shelf, aren't you basically saying that that when we're talking about this kind of determinism, we're talking about something external to the agent, and if within the agent, we would just mean biology and stuff that you're not consciously in control of, stuff
Right.
external to the agent. Determined what the agent would do, and since you had necessity, it couldn't have been otherwise. It had to
Right.
be this way. It could, in one sense of had, right? It had to be this way. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. In the world that God created, it had to be this way. And we could say, oh, you could, in the last interview, the last time you and I talked, we talked about the conditional ability to do otherwise versus the categorical ability to do otherwise. And the categorical ability to do otherwise is in the specific circumstance in which you find yourself. With nothing changed as far as antecedent conditions go, you can do one thing or the other. As far as, as Paul would say in 1 Corinthians 10:13, you can sin or you can take the way of escape. There's two alternative possibilities there. They're actually available. You have access to both of them in that specific circumstance. Now, the conditional view of alternative possibilities or the ability to do otherwise basically boils down to this. You could have done otherwise if God would have determined you to do otherwise. And I just say big deal. Nobody cares about that kind
You said that better,
ability.
Tim, than I think I've heard it said last time when you were on here. And basically it was that. It was basically like, what's that say? Like, what's that do for us, right? And I thought that was really good. Yeah, I don't know if you know, I clipped out a smaller clip of just the part about that passage and shared it.
Saw that.
Yeah, because that was so powerful and you just said it so well.
Well, thank you. Well, I just want to say that I think Bignon was right in that last clip. However, in a sense, but here's what's important to know. The Molinist can specifically explain what these greater goods are and why they require libertarian freedom. Now, the Ed Calvinist, when I say Ed, I mean exhaustive divine determinism. So the Ed Calvinist, which is Guillaume's position, he typically appeals to mystery, right? So the Molinist can tell you what these important goods are and explain why we need libertarian freedom, and then the Calvinist is going to punt to mystery. So you have to start thinking, okay, well, what's the best explanation? One that can actually explain, or one in which you say, I don't know, mystery, punt the ball. So what are these important goods that require libertarian freedom, which allow evil to then come along for the ride? Now, I think there's several, but I'll give you two. Number one, as I said earlier, the best kind of love into the infinite future requires libertarian freedom. I've made that case elsewhere. And what I spend a lot of my time discussing is rational humans. At least important kinds of rationality require libertarian freedom. And J.P. Moreland and I have an entire paper coming out very soon, which is going to make that case much stronger than I've ever made it in the past, but I have made the case in the past. So anyway, I think we're going to hear Bignon appeal to mystery in the next clip. So let's take a look at that.
Okay, sounds good.
To the end of securing some greater goods that couldn't be secured without evil.
Here we go.
These are the two typical responses that challenge the premises of the argument from the atheist against God's existence. Now, technically, both of those responses can be phrased in a single response that encapsulates both of those, and it's to say that God has morally sufficient reasons for allowing evil. And one such reason may well be to give us this indeterministic free will that ends up causing a great deal of evil, but that really can be seen as a subset of the more general response that says God has morally sufficient reasons for allowing evil. And of course, the add-on to this response is to say that just because we don't know what those reasons are, at least not in every single specific case, it doesn't follow that God cannot have those purposes behind evil, right? So that's there's this aspect of not knowing which ones they are, but having to simply maintain there are good reasons. And so there's a component of trust here from the believer.
All right, Tim. How are you going to deal with that? I mean, it sounds beautiful. You trust God, right? I mean, that's what we think when we
Right.
use those kind of, when we're dealing with atheists, we have to say, look, we may not always know what the particular reason God allows a particular thing, right? So can he use that in this case? And what's going on here?
Well, I think it's important to see a few key points here. So first, uh, Guillaume mentioned that component of trust. But think about this. If Ed is true, if exhaustive divine determinism is true, which is Guillaume's view, those who trust God are determined by God to trust God. And those who do not trust God are also determined by God not to trust him. So this component of trust is not something we actively choose to put our faith in on his view, but rather we on Ed, we passively find ourselves trusting or not trusting, right? So this component of trust or this component of faith on the Ed Calvinist view is never up to the human, right? We're not the source. It's up to something or someone else. It's up to God on Ed. And this chain of events passes through us. And God decides who this chain of events passes through, whether it be a chain of events that determines us to feel like we have faith or a chain of events that determines otherwise. But none of it is up to us. So again, trust just happens to us on this Ed view. It's not an active choice we make. And so I just wanted to point that out, but really that's not the big deal, not the main point that I want to focus on. The main issue I want to draw attention to here is this, and I've already alluded to it today, and that's that the Molinist knows exactly what the reasons are, right? We can go score a touchdown, but the Calvinist has to punt to mystery. So the best explanation, right?
Did you come up with that? Wait a minute, back up. Did you come up with that?
Oh, I've heard other people say punt to mystery before, but
I've heard punt to mystery, but I've never heard we can score a touchdown. They have to punt to mystery. Oh, that is, I'm going to make a t-shirt.
Cool.
Go ahead, Tim. I'm sorry.
Yeah. I mean, I just want to say, well, what's the best explanation? I mean, I think we can rule out exhaustive divine determinism, but until we do that, let's just say we've got two competing explanations. What's the best? The one that can specifically explain what all of these goods are, or one that just says, well, we've got goods, but who knows what they are? Well, I'm going to take the former all day long. And I think any rational theist.
And you know, Tim, if it was all ad hoc, if I felt like all of the answers given by Molinists or whoever else were just ad hoc and they were just going way beyond the evidence, they just took a bridge too far. Well, then, yeah, I would find the more wise position to be the position that says, look, I don't know, but I know there's a reason. The thing is, the thing that we're saying is the motivator behind it. First of all, we have multiple arguments, including this one that Kirk MacGregor added, the love one that you gave, and the rational one that you give about rationality and human rationality and all those things. But we also have this extreme intuition, at least that many of us have, about this. So it's not like it's just we came up with some ad hoc explanation that we like, and no one's, I mean, these guys aren't saying that, but it's the notion that what we're saying would actually provide all these extra answers that give us that satisfaction. It's not just that we want that itch of having answers scratched. It's that the thing that we immediately thought was the answer actually satisfies all of this when you plug it in and all of the grid lights up like it should. At least that's how we Molinists feel.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, Molinism has more explanatory power, explanatory scope. Seems to be simpler at the end of the day, and it's by far less ad hoc. And it also, this is what's really cool, it provides so much illumination as it helps to answer so many other tough theological questions. I've already offered an argument doing that with all the problems of evil. So Molinism, as I said in the last sentence of my book, is the best explanation of all the data. So now the Molinist says that God has morally sufficient reasons to allow evil. And they are, one, true love, and two, important kinds of rationality that I've argued, and others have as well, that both of these things require libertarian freedom. And libertarian freedom then makes finite evil possible that will eventually come to an end, at least for the citizens of heaven. So it seems to me that the Calvinist wants access to the Molinist toolbox, as it were, and says, yeah, we agree that God has morally sufficient reasons not to merely allow evil. I mean, the Molinist says that God allows evil, but then they say that, well, God has morally sufficient reasons to determine and necessitate evil, but who knows what they are. Now, I want people to focus on the difference between allow and necessitate. Even Guillaume, I believe, in the debate would use allow language. Well, he should not use that kind of language. On his view, God determines and necessitates evil. And I would argue by way of cause and effect. Guillaume might say that causation is a morass. Well, I will make an argument for that if need be. But the Molinist says that God allows evil and explains how that works, that God merely allows it. But the Calvinist determinist has to say that God determines and necessitates evil. And then says, but God has good reason to determine and necessitate evil, but who knows what they are. I just don't think that's a good explanation. And I don't think that it makes any sense to say that God has good reason to determine evil to get some greater good, when an omnipotent God could simply determine the ultimate good from the beginning, as you and I were discussing earlier. So anyway, here's the takeaway. The Molinist has specific explanations about what God's morally sufficient reasons are, and the Calvinist doesn't. Moreover, we can make a case that a deity of determinism can get a world of zero suffering and universal salvation and all the glory he could possibly ever want simply by his sheer power from the very beginning. So what do you think, Braxton?
I like it. Now, I mean, I'm convinced by it, but I want to push back in this way and say, well, what would you do? Like, so for all of us who interact with arguments from evil that atheists will bring, you kind of get to this place where you recognize, like, okay, here's one of the goods that you get, or here are some of the goods that you get from a world with evil that you can't get without a world with evil, like the ability to demonstrate sacrifice or courage. Maybe we could still get some of those things to a lesser degree in a world without evil or suffering, but it sure wouldn't be as dramatic as we seem to have it. It's why we like to watch action movies. It's why we like to watch, because any movie really, even if it's a kid's movie, there has to be some evil or confusion or darkness that has to be dealt with. And so, and I find that to be helpful. So if I were a Calvinist, could I not say, okay, I take your point, Dr. Stratton, about God determining evil, and as Guillaume was trying to say it, I think in the most neutral way, he has some, that sounds like he might have some more involvement in evil than he should. But on the other side of the coin, we can still say, you can't take this away from us, Dr. Stratton. God is painting a picture, and a beautiful picture might have some dark corners and some bright spots and all those kind of things. But that's a beautiful picture. So can we at least have that when it comes to the problem of evil? Why are you trying to take everything away from us?
Yeah, I mean, if I think it's theologically problematic to say that God needs evil. I think you and I talked about this, I was talking with Dan Chapa about this.
Yeah, but I heard it though, because you were saying what we often say about other things, which is you're saying, well, look, that means God needs. You even said he needs creation and needs sin in order to flush out some of these incredible, glorious features or attributes. That he has.
Yeah, that makes God a needy God, and then he can't even refrain from creation. If God's needy, he has to create evil, make evil happen, necessitate evil to happen. John Piper has taken a similar view. I discuss this in my book. I've got a journal article that I co-authored with Euquibus Erasmus, talking about the problems of this view. God, and if God was this needy, he wouldn't have to have all this pain, evil, and suffering in the world. He could just let Satan be the one that he torments into the infinite future and keep everybody else safe. He could get his glory from there. And think about this: if God needs all this evil and suffering in the world, then the cross wasn't enough. The cross would have been a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition. On this needy view, you need what Jesus did on the cross, plus the majority of humanity damned to hell for eternity, in order to save the elect and to let God get the glory that he desires. I explained this in my book. Not a good explanation.
Tim, I don't know if you're aware of this, but earlier this year or last year, I guess, I read Graham Oppy's Arguing About Gods. And he's probably the most formidable atheist voice in the world today, whether he's the most popular or not. And, he was talking in his book about the problem of free will in heaven. We talk about that a lot. How can you have free will in heaven and there not be evil and all those kind of things? Yep. And in that section, which wasn't a huge section, I think it was kind of like I don't know if it was an appendix, but it felt like that. But he actually says that the one thing, the one theological explanation, this is not his exact quote, this is me remembering from last year, but I made a video about it. The one explanation that makes sense of why evil here and no evil in heaven, and yet libertarian freedom here and in heaven, is if the Molinists are correct, and there was actually one world to actualize where you get a perfect heaven, but that particular world also was a world where you had the particular evils you have here on earth. And so you get the character building aspect of evil that prepares you in some sense along the path of sanctification for heaven. But at the same time, it's not as though something changes in your metaphysical makeup in heaven. It's just that no, God actualized a world, and maybe this was the only one, or there's only a few or something, where it works out like that, and you actually get a perfect. I thought it was interesting. Now, he discounts Molinism for other reasons in another chapter, but I thought that was a pretty interesting thing for you to know, since you talk about these things coming from Graham Oppy.
Yeah, I don't know how I feel about that. I haven't read that work, and I got to say, kind of takes, it kind of steals my thunder a little bit, because I've got a forthcoming. I finished this thing 2 years ago, and it's finally being published in early 2023. It's another
cool
journal article I co-authored with.
And you make that point.
Erasmus. I do make that point.
Yeah.
And in fact, go on to say how we can solve all the problems of evil, basically with
well, at the very least, Tim, you can add a name to the citation list.
Yeah, I guess I'll have to do that. So.
All right, so let's get you back on track here. I'm sorry that I sidetracked you with that. So let's get back into it. Here we go.
Of disagreement between the two views is that I'm going to take the Calvinist view to be deterministic. That's affirming theological determinism. In other words, that God determines the outcome of human free choices. So human beings make choices, we are morally responsible, but the Calvinist says those are determined by God, and even though they are determined, it doesn't mean that they are not morally responsible or free. So the Calvinist view is a compatibilist view. That's the compatibility between free will and moral responsibility on the one side and determinism on the other. And so the Calvinist affirms that, and the Molinist, among the sets of affirmations that they make, is one of incompatibilism. So the view of free will that is incompatible with determinism, sometimes called libertarianism, right? That's the view that free will is incompatible with determinism, and also that we sometimes have free will. And so that disagreement places Calvinists and Molinists on the two sides of the compatibility debate. Is it compatible with determinism? And also they are both affirming, like one is affirming determinism and the other one is denying it.
So first of all, Tim, I just got to tell you, when I was listening to this debate, I thought, I wish I could say libertarian like he does, because it sounds so cool the way he says libertarian. You need to be a libertarian, Guillaume, just because you get to say it more. Go ahead and interact with this material for us, Tim.
Yeah, well, he gave a definition of libertarianism, and I really don't like that definition. Yeah, I'm not even going to try. No, I don't like that definition, and I'm glad that Kirk provided his own definition in the debate. He didn't, it's been said before that there's no official definitions in philosophy. So explain what you mean by that, and then if you don't agree with the definition, you can say, well, this is what I mean by that. And I'm glad that Kirk provided his own definition in the debate. Now, I got to say, I did use the definition Guillaume offered in the first edition of my book, but I'm not going to use it in the second edition. And this is because there are some kinds of free will that are compatible with determinism, and I recognize that. But I don't think they're the kinds of freedom that we really care about. So, for example, I've written about this before, but it could be the case that I am completely determined, but I am also free to order tacos for dinner tonight. If I want tacos for dinner tonight, right? But big deal. But when we apply the freedom to order tacos at dinner to moral issues, one could be completely determined by God, but say that the Calvinist is free to commit adultery if he wants to commit adultery, and nothing stops him from committing adultery. So this kind of freedom isn't that great, especially when one comprehends the bigger picture that the Ed Calvinist has in mind, that God determines all things about the human, which includes your greatest wants and desires at a specific moment. So, and then if you always choose according to your greatest desire at a specific moment, and God doesn't causally determine you or prevent you from doing that, then you are determined to do it by God. Right?
Yeah, because like what you're trying to drive at is intention. You still have the intention. As long as the agent has the intention, intends to do evil, then he's culpable. But what you're pointing out is, well, yeah, but everything that led to that intention being realized in the person was also determined.
Yeah, so, God determined the intention.
And right? Guillaume doesn't deny that. Right?
What's that?
Guillaume doesn't deny this.
No, he can't, because he affirms exhaustive divine determinism. He might not use that label, but that's his position. So yeah, if one always acts on their wants and greatest desires, if nothing stops them, then they say that the Calvinist was free to commit adultery here, even though he was causally determined by God to cheat on his wife. So I think it's better to talk about libertarian freedom and then discuss the vital difference between libertarian freedom and determinism. So let's do that. And I said it before, I'll say it again. An event is determined if antecedent conditions are sufficient to necessitate the event. And since the event is necessitated by prior states, this idea is often referred to as causal determinism. But sometimes I know Guillaume doesn't want to use the word causal. Fine, I'll just talk about determinism if that's the case. Now, a person's thought, action, or choice is free in the libertarian sense if it's not random and antecedent conditions are insufficient, right? They're not sufficient to necessitate the thought, action, or choice. So, for example, if a Calvinist commits adultery, if that is true, then the Calvinist was determined by antecedent conditions, even prior to the person's existence, prior to the Calvinist's existence.
He couldn't have done otherwise.
Yeah, it necessitated the event, right? The adultery happened to him, but he did not actively choose to do this evil. None of it is up to him as the source if exhaustive divine determinism is true. Now, I think most people, when they grasp this idea, will see that the poor Calvinist who cheated on his wife could not help it, and he was a victim of the conditions, right? Intentionally created and fine-tuned by God that preceded his birth. So what say you, Braxton?
No, yeah, I mean, you're just enunciating what I've preached for years, man. I'm with you on that. I have nothing meaningful to add beyond what you just said.
All right. Well, let's go to the next clip.
Well, I mean, except just to say that, like, I think, I mean, what we're interested in truth, but the practical outflow of this can be horrific because you can because like the man who commits adultery you're talking about, he consciously experienced him doing what he couldn't have done otherwise. He had to do this, and he experienced it as a choice, but if Calvinism is true and determinism is true, he's just a passenger experiencing all of these things. That's not how they view it, but I'm saying that's how it really looks when you plug in the determinism. Well, if I take that to be the case, I was thinking of this as I was walking this morning, listening to this debate on my morning walk, and I'm walking along and I'm thinking, okay, well, let me consider, because in my morning walk, I usually consider the day before, and I pray at the end of my morning walk. So I think about sinful stuff I've done, or what's my thought life like, and all those kind of things. Well, invariably, if you're an honest person and honest with yourself and with God, you're going to find things within yourself that are not right. And maybe there are longstanding things that you're still in the process of working on. And so those things were already on my mind. So they immediately came to mind. And I thought, if I thought this, it would be so easy for me to just, not easy. I would feel required to think whatever I end up doing is what God determined I would do.
Yeah.
And my choices are all determined. My thoughts are all determined. My beliefs are all determined. So I'll tell you, I think it would serve as at least some sort of a reaction in my depravity to the conviction of the Holy Spirit that otherwise might work on me to the point of repentance about things. I know how that sounds to Calvinists. I'm giving you biographical information about me, and I've heard a lot of other people say this. If it's not true about you, praise the Lord. And ultimately, it does matter what's true. But these are some of my reactions.
Yeah, and it kind of seems to me like it can be used as a get out of jail free card. Because they're like, well, I if somebody believed that, and I used to be that guy, right? I could justify. I used to be a Calvinist and an exhaustive divine determinist. And so if I did something that was wrong, objectively wrong, I could be like, well, God determined me to do it. Yeah. Was it what I wanted to do? Yep. But God determines my wants and I can't do otherwise. And I've written on this on my website too. It's just, it's a dangerous view, I think. And
all right. So here we are. He says Molinism, what, Guillaume?
Itself doesn't tell us just how strongly the Molinist story of evil and the Calvinist story of evil are going to differ. What's going to matter is any specific Molinist, how much they are going to be using libertarian free will as a response to the problem of evil, to say those instances of evil only happened because we have libertarian free will and God tried to bring things differently, right? To bring about things differently, but because those counterfactuals limit his options, this is an evil that happens that's purely explained by libertarian free will. No other greater purpose than this, just libertarian free will. So the more a Molinist does that, the more he disagrees with the Calvinist, but he doesn't have to do that a whole lot, right? He could say that almost all of the evil that happens, God has simple greater goods that he's looking after, and this is exactly what he wants to bring about for the sake of those greater goods, exactly like the Calvinist says.
I'll just reiterate what I've already made clear. The Molinist doesn't say that it's just about free will, period. Right? We say that it's about the best kind of love and important kinds of rationality worth wanting. And then we make the case as to why these things both require humans to possess libertarian freedom. So it's not just about libertarian freedom for the sake of libertarian freedom. Libertarian freedom makes these greater goods possible. And on top of all of that, as I showed in my evil argument against all the problems of evil that I offered earlier in this video, it's all the problems of evil. It's not just moral evil here, right? God's middle knowledge is also a key aspect in solving these problems that face all the views that deny this aspect of God's knowledge. So I respectfully disagree with my brother Guillaume here, and that it's not just about libertarian freedom. It's about libertarian freedom and what God knows prior to his libertarian free choice to create this specific world.
All right, let's look at another clip here, Tim.
So I think it's going to be helpful to see a little bit just where on the spectrum of Molinists Kirk falls, because I've heard him say some pretty robust things in favor of God's providence in the past. And I think I've mentioned to him that some of the things he says make me think that he's the kind of Molinist that I would be if I had to give up my Calvinism. That is, that he's making some pretty strong statements about predestination and election. I think that in his book, he's explaining that Molina rejects Arminius's exegesis of Romans 9. He's saying that election is not it's not a corporate election. It's not based on foreseen faith. That it's purely the electing grace of God. And that Molina says that any saved person in this world could have been lost, and any lost could have been saved in alternate worlds, and it's all in God's providence that one happens and not the other. So those kinds of very robust statements about providence and election are extremely close, and they almost melt my Calvinist heart. But we'll see just how much of a use of libertarian free will Kirk makes in this conversation about evil. For all I know, he could be telling a very similar story as the Calvinist one here.
And I'd say that, Guillaume is mentioning how close these two views are, but there's some really big differences. And, I guess the first thing, I've heard him say on multiple occasions that if Calvinism were proven false, that his next favorite view is Molinism. So I'm taking that to mean that he would be a Molinist if Calvinism, if he was convinced that Calvinism is false. So I'm hoping and praying that he does become a Molinist. But here's some of the differences. I mean, most Molinists that I talk to, and definitely not all, but a whole lot of them anyway, including me, if it was demonstrated to me that Molinism was false, I definitely wouldn't be an exhaustive divine determinist, and I'd probably be an open theist. And I would hate to do that because I think that's a low view of God as well. But I think it's better than the Calvinist view, especially the one that attaches itself to exhaustive divine determinism. So yeah, I do think Molinism is the best explanation here. But yes, I do want to agree.
Well, before you go on, Tim, I was going to say, I remember in the debate, we didn't play the clip here, but he sets up the four primary options that you have. Yeah. Which is you have Arminian, you have like open theism, a simple foreknowledge view, Molinism, and Calvinism. And he says on that spread, I've put those in the order of how much alike they are, or the progression. And he says, so Molinism is right next door to Calvinism. Well, maybe in that listing of four. And so I get that. And I like that he thinks that it touches on enough of the things that he's interested in, or that he thinks are true, that if Calvinism fell, he'd go there. But the distance between Calvinism and Molinism is as vast as the difference between libertarian freedom and determinism, because those other three views affirm libertarian freedom. The people usually affirm libertarian freedom. That puts all three of those other views in a completely different category as Calvinism. Yeah. So it may be the closest to Calvinism, but depending on what one is thinking about related to these things at a particular point, it is still a long way from Calvinism, because that key issue, and it's what matters here in this issue that we're discussing right now that he's talking about, is that however much alike we are, the libertarian freedom is the primary thing. And he even says that. He's like, so that's why we got to find out how much that's a part of this.
Yeah, and that's well said, Braxton. There's a huge separation between the two views. But Calvinists and Molinists are very similar. We do share some important beliefs. In fact, as many probably know, and I've said this already on this video, I believe, I used to hold to Bignon's exact view, and I was quite aggressive about it. I not only held to all 5 points of Calvinism, but I affirmed exhaustive divine determinism, that God determined all things, all the time, including every twist and turn of all of my thoughts and my evaluations and my deliberations and everything like that, all my judgments, that God determined them. Now, I was a pastor during that time, and I would preach it from the pulpit. I would preach determinism and 5-point Calvinism from the pulpit, and I would fight anyone who disagreed, including my wife. In fact, I wrote an article on my website called Molinism Saves Marriages. I encourage people to go see that. But once I grasped the doctrine of middle knowledge, I realized that God could predestine all things without determining all things. And that melted my Calvinist heart. and then I was transformed into a Molinist. So I'm hoping and praying that Guillaume's heart, his Calvinist heart, melts into a Molinist heart soon. But
we're going to melt it. We're going to melt it, Guillaume. We're coming for you. What do you call them? What did you call Dan Chap? Freedom fighter. The freedom fighters are coming for you, Guillaume.
The libertarian freedom fighters.
Libertarian freedom fighters. Okay. All right.
We're, us libertarian freedom fighters are always fighting for the French.
Hey, we'll take the French, man. We'll take the French.
We love the French. So, yeah. And we don't want to fight the French. We want to fight for them. Anyway, I'll just say this transformation of mine, where my Calvinist heart was melted into a Molinist heart, that was either up to me, and I was not causally determined on that journey, or God determined me. God determined me to have the truth about, think about how awkward and absurd this would be, that God determined me to have the truth about determinism and preach it from the pulpit for all those years. And then, even though I was preaching truth, decided to determine me to hold false theological beliefs. Now, I'll tell you, if you're going to make that move, that's going to get us into all kinds of problems when it comes to epistemic evil, which is, I think, the biggest problem of evil that the Calvinist faces. And that's going to open a huge can of worms for the Calvinists, but we will talk about that later. J.P. Moreland and I talk a lot about that in our paper.
I'm so glad you're writing that paper with Moreland. Yeah. I'm so glad. That's going to be so powerful. Yeah. I can't wait.
Well, thank you. And thanks for taking a look at it before we submitted it.
Yeah.
But even thanked you at the end.
I appreciate
you
it,
and
man.
Pritchett for taking a look at it.
Melts my Molinist heart.
But so here's the bottom line. Both Calvinists and Molinists, here's what we affirm. We both affirm exhaustive predestination. What we disagree with is the mechanism, as it were, in which God brings it about. Now, one mechanism rejects libertarian freedom, and the other mechanism affirms it. Thus, I argue that the Calvinist mechanism rejects the best kind of love and important kinds of rationality, and the Molinist mechanism gets to keep the best kind of love and important kinds of rationality, not to mention desert responsibility. So we both affirm predestination. We just argue over how God predestines all things. Mm-hmm. And so in one sense, it's really kind of a silly disagreement, right? We're both affirming exhaustive predestination. Now, I have seen some Calvinists back away from that, actually, when it comes to double predestination. As a Molinist, I say, well, God can't help it if he's omnipotent and omniscient, and he creates, everything is predestined, right? But so it's kind of a silly disagreement, but in another sense, it might be the most important of all the secondary issues of theology, since we're talking about love, the use of reason, and desert responsibility, all of which are discussed or implied in Scripture. So I think it's pretty important. But anyway, I think we should probably move to MacGregor's opening speech and talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, let's go ahead and do that. Goodbye, Bignon, and hello, MacGregor.